Welcome to the Bar Exam Toolbox podcast. Today we are going to be sharing some thoughts on why people from prestigious schools can still fail the bar exam. Your Bar Exam Toolbox hosts are Alison Monahan and Lee Burgess, that's me. We are here to demystify the bar exam experience so you can study effectively, stay sane, and hopefully pass and move on with your life. We're the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, and the career-related website Career Dicta. Alison also runs the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review on your favorite listening app and check out our sister podcast, the Law School Toolbox podcast. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can reach us via the contact form on barexamtoolbox.com, and we'd love to hear from you. And with that, let's get started.
Welcome back to the Bar Exam Toolbox podcast. Today, we're talking about why people who went to very prestigious law schools still fail the bar exam. I mean, in some ways, this is a perennial mystery. I don't think there's a single law school in the entire country in any year that ever has a 100% bar pass rate. Even at these super prestigious schools, people still fail every single year. How is this possible?
Well, I think there are a lot of factors. I guess the good news is for anyone that's failed the bar is that everyone's in great company because
lots of people
lots of people fail from all kind of walks of life, and there are lots of different reasons. So I guess the first one is that sometimes people have a bad day. You know, they could be sick, have a lot of family issues, have just suffered through some emotional trauma, gone through a bad breakup, had a computer crash. Sometimes these external things can happen that help you or that stand in your way of performing at your best. But it's not just that. There are a lot of other reasons that people fail. I think testing anxiety or generalized anxiety are big ones because that can really cause your brain to freeze and then you go blank. You can't remember what you studied. But even at these prestigious schools, some people are just poor test takers.
Yep. No, that's definitely true. We definitely talk to people who did not pass the bar from, very good law schools. And a lot of times what we hear is, well, I've never been a great standardized test taker, but I was admitted for other reasons. So, it's not like it's that shocking if you've had trouble on the LSAT, you had trouble on the SAT, but you've overcome those scores and managed to get into and through a very good school, that the bar exam is probably still going to present some obstacles.
Yeah. And it can be really tricky for a lot of folks. I think at these students who are at these prestigious schools, even those who are generally good test takers, oftentimes don't really know how to study for an exam that is really about minimum competency.
Right.
I think
that's a
can
fair
be
point.
Such a tricky thing. I think on one hand, I've seen plenty of high performing students from either prestigious schools or even, pretty much any law school, but they were at the top of their class. They oftentimes will fail because they overstudy. They study like they're trying to learn all the tiny, tiny details, and then they forget to answer the question asked and just do what is being asked of them on the test. And I think that can become really tricky. Understudying can also be a problem because if you assume that because you went to this prestigious school that you are excellent at exams, that minimum competency you probably already have, and so you don't study like this test is a challenging test, but you still have to study for it. And then that could be a downer. I mean, I failed the first written driving test because I didn't study.
I failed the California one too.
Yeah, well, it was funny. I feel like I failed it, and then I was 15, and I went to my mom, and I'm like, I can't believe I failed. She's like, well, did you study? And I'm like, well, for like a couple hours before the test. And she's like, well, maybe that wasn't the best plan. We can come back and you can do it again later. I was
right.
Like,
I think that does point to what a lot of the problems seem to arise from, which is that a lot of these schools, I went to a top school. You don't learn any of this stuff that you're supposed to know for the bar exam. Yep. This is not the exam format you are actually used to, that you've trained in. We had completely open book, open note exams. I never had to memorize anything. I think I had one class where half of the exam, which was evidence, was closed book multiple choice. That was the only multiple choice we ever did. It was the only closed book exam I ever had. This is a different format test than what people have been used to doing in a lot of these schools.
Yeah, many law schools are giving, issue spotter, fact pattern, typical exam hypos that you're going to see kind of reflected in the UBE or the California Bar. But at these elite schools, these prestigious schools, oftentimes they're doing exams on legal theory. They're
exactly. We're writing about the policy of crime and punishment, not talking about homicide.
Right. And that can be really tricky to shift gears. And the other thing that happens is, the bar really wants you to write in strict IRAC. It wants you to be very formulaic. That's oftentimes not how you're rewarded in these more prestigious schools, especially if you're writing essays on legal theory. You're not doing it in a strict IRAC or CREAC format. And so you also have to get out of your comfort zone and try and do something in a very different way that maybe you've never gotten comfortable doing in law school.
No, I think that's a great point. And even people who've done well in law school were really being rewarded for something different than what the bar exam is rewarding. And I think that's the biggest takeaway here is this is a specific type of exam. And it may be that this very expensive education that you've paid a lot of money for and spent a lot of time doing, it may not actually have prepared you for this. And I think that's just a critical thing to keep in mind, that there's no guarantee that you are necessarily going to pass because, like we said, people always fail from every single school.
Yep. It's so true. I also think that, the bar is a bit of its own kind of pressure cooker. So if you have any issues like ADHD, as we mentioned already, testing anxiety, any sort of learning difference, anything that makes these very strict time constraint filled exams more challenging, it's going to come out.
Right.
I mean, it's like it cannot be ignored for the bar. So maybe you were able to lay these issues to the side, especially the later years of law school, and maybe you weren't taking the same type of exams. Maybe you weren't under as much time pressure. You were mostly doing papers or take-home exams. But now we're back to the, sit down, do 3 hours of work, check all these boxes, do what needs to be done. And that might not jive with either how your brain works or how you perform at your best. And so you're going to have to figure out how to handle that situation.
Right. And I think for a lot of people, the bar is just not that interesting. So if
that's true too.
If you're a person who is, considers yourself to be very smart, very quick, you pick things up, and you don't like to do things that you don't want to do or you don't find interesting, this can be a big challenge because you've just got to sit down and learn a lot of material. It can be frustrating because you're like, I'm going to be a business litigator at a large firm. Why do I have to study family law? This is pointless. Doesn't matter. You still have to study it.
Yep. So true. I've definitely seen life stuff get in the way. And maybe this goes to like a bit of an overconfidence, or maybe this idea that you can understudy because you are a smart person or you consider yourself a smart person. But I've heard a lot of people from prestigious schools be like, well, I was studying, but I was also moving and planning my wedding, or I got married a month before the test, or I have another job and I'm clerking and I'm working full time and I'm studying, at night during the weekends. Or, there can be lots of other stuff going on. And so they're just trying to squeeze in studying in these little tiny crevices left in their life. And sometimes that's just not going to be enough.
Right. No, I definitely made that mistake when I was studying after graduating from law school, and I decided to also pre-clerk. And so I was working all day, and then I thought I would study at night, and I didn't really study at night. So, I started studying, frankly, like way too late. And I did pass, but that's because I took an easy exam with a high pass rate. It's highly likely I would have failed if I'd taken a different exam.
Yeah. And you didn't have learning differences that made it challenging, and you didn't, I think that you also were in a position that you didn't have these other things like testing anxiety and that were like bubbling up for you in that way. Right.
But I definitely think I did not really give enough credence to the idea that I needed to study for a extended period of time. I was like, money is great. Like, I'm going to be clerking. I'm not going to be making as much money as my friends will when they started a firm. So why don't I just work for 6 weeks and then split that time? It'll be fine. I'm a smart person. I can totally do it. And it worked out, but it probably wasn't necessarily like the best decision of my life. In reality, I probably would have been better off not getting paid for those few weeks and making sure I was really devoting the time and energy that was needed to be sure that I was going to pass.
Yeah. You also mentioned that there's some overconfidence and sometimes arrogance that plays into this too.
would never fail the bar exam. Come on. I mean, I took both of them with that attitude, to be honest. Although I was not confident when I went into the California exam that I was going to pass, I'll be honest.
But I think, on one hand, there's that delicate balance, right? You want to be confident because you want to sound confident and all of that kind of stuff. But you don't want to be so overconfident that you're not putting in the work or just assuming that you know the answers.
You have to be realistic.
It's a delicate balance.
You have to be realistic. Confidence is great if it doesn't get in the way of you actually sitting down and learning some material that you need to know in order to pass this exam.
Yep. So some of these issues are unavoidable, right? If you can't control getting a stomach bug or a migraine or something like that. But a lot of these can be avoided with some foresight and some planning. So what do you think are some of the warning signs that you might be on track to fail the bar?
Well, I think the biggest one, and I'm assuming it's fairly obvious, is your grades. There's a pretty high correlation between people's grades in law school, particularly the first year, and their success rate on the bar. So if you're someone who, really struggled your first year, struggled a lot with writing, you're at the bottom of your class, even if you're at the bottom of your class at Harvard, that is still a risk factor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And there has to be kind of some honesty with yourself about that because for anyone in law school, but especially I think those at these prestigious schools, you get past those first 1 year classes and then you're really getting into seminars and, and externships and this and that, and grades just become secondary. You do have to go back and evaluate those early grades to see if they are foreshadowing problems coming down the pipe.
Right, exactly. And I know that they try to compress everyone into, very broad bands where it's not clear if your grades are better or worse than anyone else's because you're all very special snowflakes. But, on some level, you kind of know where you are. And I think that's worth taking seriously. The other factor I would say is one of the bigger factors is just your past history with standardized tests. Are you a person who has always struggled with standardized testing? If so, I would venture a guess that you're probably going to struggle somewhat with the bar exam.
Yeah, which means you shouldn't mail it in. It doesn't mean that it's impossible.
Right.
You're just going to need to be very deliberate and make sure you're set up for success. That's
right.
Fine. You just have to be honest about it.
Right. And you want to, probably for someone who's always had a history of struggling with these standardized tests, particularly multiple choice, it's probably not the case that you're just going to sign up for some standard, huge course, do some videos, and then pass. That's not your reality, unfortunately.
Yeah. And we talked a little bit about anxiety, generalized anxiety, testing anxiety, or issues with focus. If you've got, identified these issues in the past, if you've struggled with them in the past, they are going to pop up on the bar and you want to make sure even more. And so you want to make sure you have a plan. Do you have a therapist? Do you have coping mechanisms? If you take medication, have you already talked to your doctor? Have you tried that medication? Do you know what the medication is? Don't wait until a month before the bar to start experimenting with medication. It sounds kind of silly when I say it, but we talk to a lot of people who will say, oh, and I started taking new ADHD medicine, which made it hard for me to get up in the morning 3 weeks before the bar.
Right.
It's okay, well, 3 weeks before the bar is not a great time to experiment with meds, right? If you can help it.
Yeah, I would get those dialed in, minimum month before.
Yeah. So you need to be making those appointments and getting yourself set up, early in the game. So you're not trying to troubleshoot these issues, a few weeks before the test.
Right. And I think kind of along those lines, another thing that we see a lot is just issues with motivation, issues with executive functioning, to help you study properly. Throughout law school, did you struggle to get your work done? Were you procrastinating a lot? Do you feel like maybe you don't even want to be a lawyer now? You're not sure you even want to practice, and maybe you shouldn't be taking this exam anyway. If those are kind of your thought processes, that's totally fine. But that is not probably setting you up for immediate success on the bar exam.
Yeah, no, it's totally true. And you want to go back to the feedback from those 1L professors, especially if you did stop taking exam-based classes, and think about what some of those meetings, hopefully you went to meetings with those 1L professors after your exams, and what feedback you got. If you struggled with legal analysis and issue spotting, those are some red flags that you want to make sure that you pay attention to in order to get ready for the test.
Yeah, and sometimes I think professors are pretty blunt about this type of thing. I've had students tell me, like, my professor told me that I'm at risk of failing the bar, and I'm really upset about that. And I feel like that was a really mean thing for them to say to me. And I'm like, well, actually, I understand maybe it wasn't the nicest way of putting it. However, you need to take that seriously. These people see a lot of students, and if they see a real problem in your writing and your analysis, that is something that, needs to be considered when you're preparing for the exam.
Yeah, no, it's very true. I think sometimes, especially if you've gotten some troubling feedback your 1L year, you might have crammed it down in a hole. And
put it in a box. Close the lid, never think about it.
Right. And it's no fun to kind of reopen that stuff and critically think about it. But it's all part of our stories, and you've got to go revisit it and see what you can learn from it, and then you can put it back in the box.
Right. And it's not necessarily pleasant. And I think, for a lot of people thinking back 2 years later on this 1L experience that maybe wasn't the greatest year, it can be painful. It can be upsetting. And, I think just trying to take that deep breath and get whatever support you need to deal with the emotional fallout, but then taking a practical look at, like, okay, what is the truth of what they were telling me, and how do I start to correct that? And this really feeds into what I think is another kind of risk factor sign is people who aren't necessarily thinking about how they should be preparing for this exam. The people who just sign up for a prep class, assume that if they just do everything that they're told to do, they're going to be fine. It's like, oh, just do everything they tell you, you're going to pass. That's just not true. So if you haven't taken that step back to sort of think like, okay, what's going to work for me? Like, how am I going to make sure that I am set up to take this exam? I think that can be a real risk factor.
Yeah, I think that that's very true. And, it's kind of tricky to ask yourself these questions, because a lot of times people will say, well, I don't know how I should prepare because I'm not a bar exam expert.
Right.
It's like, yeah, but you have been taking legal exams probably for approximately 3 years. So really evaluating what you've done in the past and just making sure that, the time you're putting in is getting you close to the output, and I think that disconnect between how the exam is actually executed and how you're preparing for it is something that you always have to constantly be asking yourself. And, we've worked with people who, have, picture perfect memories and can say, well, I can see the outline in my head, but they still can't execute the question because I think they think because they can see the outline in their head, like that's the whole game.
Right. Like if I just know the law, it's like, well, no one's asking you to write down your criminal law outline, unfortunately.
Right. You have to be able to apply it in issue spot and do all of these other things. And so even if a lot of things maybe have come easy to you because of how your brain functions, there are still likely going to be parts of studying for this test that are going to be tricky.
Right. I think it's just a matter of looking at, how do I learn best? How does that correspond to what a prep company is giving me to work with? And how am I going to use these materials? So for me, like, I am a very visual learner. I'm not somebody who can sit and like watch or listen to things. Like I barely watch TV. So the idea of listening to hours and hours of lectures to prepare for the exam made no sense to me. So I do give myself credit that I did not do that. What I did and why I think the reason that I passed these tests was I really focused on being as efficient as possible and doing as much practice as possible. And I think that's probably, what pulled me over the finish line.
Yeah. And a lot of that is just being honest and really, kind of evaluating how things are going, a little bit of self-reflection. I think one thing that people who are real doers, I think a lot of people at prestigious schools get there because they work really hard. I think there are definitely people who don't work very hard, but there are a lot of people that do work very hard. And so sometimes I think there's also this assumption of like, well, I'm just a hard worker, so I will just study harder than everybody else.
Right.
But it's
more hours, more time.
Yeah, more hours, less sleep, whatever it might be. And that's just not the road to success. You have to be constantly evaluating and pivoting to make sure this is working for you. So this is one area where just hard work is not going to necessarily get all the box checked.
Right. I think people do get that mindset of like, I just have to check these boxes. If they tell me to work 12 hours a day and to do this, and I check these boxes, like, I'm going to be fine. I'm going to be fine. It's going to be fine. Like, I have to be fine. And that people put so much pressure on themselves and just kind of like spin on this hamster wheel of like doing this work without really reflecting on whether that's getting them closer to the passing score.
Yeah. And, we've all met people that are not that impressive from these prestigious schools.
I was a TA, trust me.
You know, not to say that the folks who are graduating from these prestigious schools are not, many of them, very impressive people, but some of them are not. And so you can't just assume that because you have these credentials that this is just going to be a checkbox for you. I mean, we interview lots of people to work for us, and we test some knowledge of the law, which people can look at open book. It's not a closed universe timed exam. And people with amazing credentials still get things wrong because I think they don't go to look it up because they think they should know it.
Well, I mean, and also people get into prestigious schools for all kinds of reasons, but that's probably a different podcast.
That's true.
But I will say I was pretty underwhelmed with some of the work product that I received as a TA. So yeah, I think, again, I think that just goes back to this overconfidence in a lot of ways, that this is one of those things that, might for some people really be one of the first times they run into this immovable obstacle that doesn't really care where they went to prep school. They just care that they write down the answer and get the points.
Yeah, that's true. So if you are studying for the exam and things are not going swimmingly, maybe you take a moment, you've listened to this podcast, and you're like, I should evaluate how things are going, and I think I'm in trouble. What do you do?
Well, I mean, hopefully people can do some of this before they're studying for the exam.
Yeah.
And I think at that point, again, like we said, you've got to do that self-reflection and then really think about researching your options carefully and getting the help that you personally need. So, pinpointing those areas of weakness. You've always been bad at standardized testing. You've always been bad at multiple choice, and make a real plan to correct those things. And that might mean, getting a tutor. It might mean working with your school. It might mean all kinds of different things, but you've got to have some plan to correct the problems that you see in your preparation.
Yeah. And I think you want to be constantly evaluating, because I've also seen folks come to especially the multiple choice piece and say, well, I've always been good at standardized tests, so I'm sure I'll be good at this too.
Right.
And it is slightly different than most standardized tests.
It's a very, very difficult test. Like I will say, I'm a person who's been good at standardized testing. That's how I got through life. And the MBE is no joke. Like you have to know a lot of information. The questions are hard. It is after the day that I took the first MBE for my first bar exam, I was completely convinced I was going to fail. I mean, my friend from law school, literally had to talk me off the ledge to even show up the next day.
Yeah, it's super tricky. So just because you've made these assumptions, and you've been like, oh, well, I've been so good at standardized tests. Well, great. Try this one. See how it goes.
Right. And this is definitely a place for a growth mindset, because it's probably not going to go that well to start with. And that doesn't mean that you are suddenly bad at standardized tests. It doesn't mean you're not a smart person. It means that this is a challenging exam that you are going to have to study for.
Yeah. So you don't want to wait too late to practice and memorize, because those pieces are very critical. But I would add to that you also want to practice, memorize, and evaluate your work, and make sure that you're really giving yourself some honest feedback. And if you're not able to give yourself honest feedback, find someone that can.
Right. And I think the memorization part is really key, because as I mentioned earlier, this is not something most people at prestigious law schools have really had to do that much. Like we didn't memorize the law. It wasn't considered relevant because you could just go look it up. So I think the memorization piece can really hit people pretty hard, particularly if you wait until the very last minute, which is what some of these study schedules are having you do. I mean, there's just no way that you're going to be able to cram all the stuff in your head in the last couple of weeks.
Yep. I think it's also important to have some solid condensed materials to study off of, especially if your law school did not cover a lot of substantive law, which I always feel so bizarre saying out loud, to be like, well, you went to Harvard where they didn't really teach you the crimes in criminal law, so you better get a good outline to learn them.
And the outline shouldn't be a telephone book. The amount of material that you need for the exam is relatively limited. We like the Smart Bar Prep outlines. There are other ones floating around. But you're kind of looking, I would say for most topics, ideally in the 20 to 30 pages. And you can make these yourself. You can get them. But that's kind of what you should be looking at and studying off of primarily, because you just don't need more information than that.
Nope, you really don't. I also think that, using tools like Adaptabar, where you can really dive into the data, is a good thing. You want to make sure that there are no pockets of substantive knowledge that are missing, especially around some of these core 1L subjects. And the nice thing is Adaptable is going to be able to help you kind of suss through that. So that's another thing to definitely look at, using tools that'll give you data and help you identify holes in your knowledge that'll make you more efficient as you study.
Absolutely. I mean, when I was doing the MBE in a computerized way, it pretty quickly pointed out that I really had a completely bizarre misconception about the Fourth Amendment. And there were reasons for that. You know, I had this weird professor for some bizarro class, some seminar, who told us all these things that were actually not true. But I had to relearn that, you know, and it was useful to have that pointed out so that I knew, like, oh, right, I have no idea what this law is. I need to sit down with an outline and actually look at it. And I think that helps you be realistic about where you're at, too. You know, if you're using AdaptBar and getting 50% on the MBE, well, that's a problem.
Yeah. Yeah. We mentioned, you know, if you've had testing anxiety, if you've struggled with ADHD or other learning differences, that you may want to examine accommodations. You should get them if you qualify for them, and you should apply for them as early as possible.
Absolutely.
No two ways about it.
Yeah, definitely. Particularly in the online exam world where things are taking longer and longer. This is not something to procrastinate on. You know, if you're listening to this, you could probably already be applying. So I would probably do that. Yeah, the other thing I think, you know, we mentioned earlier is you've got to really think carefully about how you're going to protect your study time. So I know it's tempting to take a job or, you know, think, oh, I'll just, you know, pack everything up and move across the country in the middle of the exam study period. I'll get married, you know, whatever it is. I'll adopt a new puppy. All of these things are probably not the best idea. Like, you know, this is a time to focus on this exam because we talk to so many people where things like this really prevent them from passing, and it's really frustrating.
Yeah. I know that you feel like you should be able to be superhuman and do it all, but the reality is most of us aren't.
Right. And everyone needs time to study for this exam. I mean, think of all the famous people who have failed the bar exam. All of those people were highly competent, intelligent, you know, accomplished people, and they all failed because mostly, I mean, 95% of the time, because they did not put the time in to study. Yep.
The other thing that you need to think about is if you fall into the category of people that just doesn't want to be a lawyer, which, you know, we get, hey, it's fine. No worries. Like, you still need to decide what you're going to do about this test. Like, should you put it off? Should you go to therapy? Should you, be going to a coach? Like, what should you be doing? But blowing off this test and still spending money and time on it is probably not the best way to approach it.
No, I think it's understandable, but I think it's misguided. You know, if you are pretty sure that at least at this point in your life, you're like, I did my 3 years of law school, I'm graduating from this top school, I hated every second of it, I don't like any of my classmates, I really want to be, you know, I don't know, a programmer, whatever it is that you really want to do. I really want to write movies. I mean, on some level, just go do that. You know, you can always come back and try to take the bar if you find out that actually being a writer is kind of terrible. And I know there's huge pressure for people, just pass the bar, just pass the bar. But if you're really in that headspace of like, I just don't want to do this, I cannot motivate myself to study, there's really no point.
Yeah. Yeah. Or just decide like, okay, I will study for it and then actually give it like an old college try, you know?
Right.
Like,
I think, yeah,
don't half-ass it.
No, I think it's different if you're like, you know what, I'm really not sure that I want to practice, but it would open up options. And, you know, there is an argument to be made for just taking these 2 months and doing it. Sure. Give it your best shot. But if you're going to do it, commit to at least studying. You commit to the exercise of trying to pass the test. If you are not at a point where you can commit to that, I don't think there's any reason to suffer through taking the exam. I mean, you can just go and you know, do something else.
Yep. Or, you know, now that you can somewhat forum shop, the other option is to just pass the exam somewhere. You know, I definitely knew someone in law school that struggled with the California bar, wanted to just work in politics, didn't want to practice at all. So he just went and took it somewhere easier just to check the box.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's
Nothing
why I
wrong
took
with
the
that
Massachusetts exam. I mean, I couldn't decide which one to take. And my judge was like, well, why don't you take Massachusetts? It has a 90% pass rate. And I'm like, why don't I do that? That seems better than California or New York. And in the end, like, as long as I was admitted someplace, it really didn't matter that much.
Yep. So what if you do all these things or some of these things or none of these things and you end up failing? So I think for a lot of people who are used to doing well, or they wouldn't have ended up at some of these schools, this can feel like your career is over.
I do think people feel that. It can be really crushing for a lot of people. This might be the first time they've legitimately failed and just been, slapped in the face. No, there's no way around it. You failed. You did not pass. But I think you just have to put it in perspective. It's one exam. It's 2 or 3 days of your life. You did not succeed at that time. Your career is not over. Your life is not over. Your parents will presumably still love you. None of these things are completely crushing, and this happens to a lot of people. So frustrating though it is, I do not think this is the end of the world.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think it's just so critical to try and just keep perspective. We oftentimes, have to remind people that this is just a moment in your career. Down the road, nobody's going to really remember when you sat for the bar, when you got your license. I mean, this is stuff that feels so big in the moment, but it will be in your rearview mirror at some point. And it's just getting past this hurdle, not, letting it really mark, be this black mark on your transcript that you can't get past.
Right. I think the only way people end up knowing you failed the bar is if you become really famous, and then it becomes an inspirational story about how, well, Hillary Clinton failed and so did Michelle Obama. Come on.
I know, right?
So if anyone finds out you failed, it's probably because you're very famous.
That's true. And, I think most of us would agree, Michelle Obama, she's pretty smart. She's doing pretty well. Most people don't talk about that often, although she talked about it in her book.
She did, and she totally owned it. She was basically like, I didn't study, and I failed.
Yep.
Same thing with Hillary Clinton. She's like, I didn't study, I failed.
Yep.
Kind of what tends to happen. Kathleen Sullivan wrote a textbook on con law, didn't study for the California bar, failed.
Right.
Are you sensing a trend here?
Well, any final thoughts?
No, I think I don't want to make people super paranoid about this because, the reality is most people from these schools do pass on the first try and certainly eventually. But I do think it's something just to be aware of. If you are in that position of being someone who has risk factors for failing the bar, it's something to take seriously, and just make sure you get the help that you need, because it's a lot better to pass on your first try or even your second than have to struggle through and do the same things over and over and then end up taking it multiple times.
Yeah, it really is. I really think just taking this test at face value and being thoughtful and evaluating things and just making sure that you are doing work that needs to be done. Like, you don't have to be cuckoo crazy about it, but you do have to take it seriously. Like our driving test example, right? Don't be like us.
We
should
both
have just
passed
studied for the
eventually.
driving test. We did, yes. And I consider us both very good drivers all these years later. So I think we're okay.
Yeah, but that had nothing to do with whether I knew the speed limit for crossing a train track.
Nope.
Which I do recall as a question on my driving test.
But, this is one of those things that no matter how brilliant you are, you just got to study and get through it.
Right. There's a number where this is the correct answer. And to this day, I probably couldn't tell you whether it's 25, 35, or 45, but there is a correct answer and I should have known it.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. All right. Well, with that, we are out of time. I want to take a second to remind you to check out our blog at barexamtoolbox.com, which is full of helpful tips to help you prepare and stay sane as you study for the bar exam. You can also find information on our website about our courses, tools, and one-on-one tutoring programs to support you as you study for the UBE or California bar exam. If you enjoyed this episode of the Bar Exam Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave a review and rating on your favorite listening app. We'd really appreciate it, and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. If you're still in law school, you might also like to check out our popular Law School Toolbox podcast as well. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to myself or Alison at lee@barexamtoolbox.com or Alison@barexamtoolbox.com, or you can always contact us via our website contact form at barexamtoolbox.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk soon.